Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. So I've had a few react videos to weird history. As I always say, sometimes I love what they say, sometimes I hate it with passion. We'll see what we have today. Last time we checked the slaves, they were talking about slaves, and now still a different section from a same video. They have a part that actually deals with what the ancient Romans ate. And I'm very interested in that because it's a topic that I've covered myself. So let's have a look.
His unsuccessful winter campaign of 150 BCE in central Spain, Appian wrote,
I hate BCE, so I'm just going to say it to counter it. BC.
Their soldiers were sick because of the unaccustomed food which the country afforded. They had no wine, no salt, no vinegar, no oil, but lived on wheat and barley, and the flesh of deer and rabbits boiled without salt, which...
Yes, that's a passage that I've used myself. It's very interesting. I'll comment on it in a second.
Caused dysentery, from which many died.
Yeah.
Many historians interpreted this to mean that Roman soldiers did not usually eat meat at all.
And I disagree with that. I think it was mostly a situation with game and also the fact that they didn't have salt. Did you notice that? Now, oftentimes salt in classical antiquity is used as a preservative and it helps conserve your food. It is very likely then that since this was a situation where the Roman legionaries did not have access to food, there is a whole situation that I have discussed on my dedicated video, link in the description, but it is very likely that they were starving, they were really hungry, they just ate the meat. It may have been spoiled because of the lack of salt, and also they weren't used to eating game, which is different from eating, like we know that the Romans had herds and flocks with them, so they would have eaten a different type of meat, but I do believe it has to do with conservation in this case.
But other sources make it clear that soldiers were merely reluctant to eat meat that wasn't treated with salt, since it was likely to spoil.
Yeah.
Appian, in other passages, mentioned soldiers eating boiled and roasted meat, and the historian Plutarch reports that soldiers were supposed to eat meat, bread, and stew.
Yeah, so when it comes to that, I think the frequency is something that we can debate these days. This idea that the Roman legionaries had a vegetarian diet is nonsense. They did eat meat, but the one thing that we can debate is how often. I think my guess is that Roman legionaries, we eat meat approximately once a week. And the reason why I say that is because it is mentioned in the sources that in the late Roman period, the legionaries were getting used to eat meat more often and they were now eating it twice a week, which kind of gives you the idea, they're not really saying it, but if you read it between the lines, it kind of gives you the idea, okay, so they weren't eating it twice a week. My guess is probably once a week, maybe once every 10 days, but that is not including lard, because lard they would eat more often. I'm talking about actually making a freaking steak or like butchering animals and eating their meats. So yeah, maybe 3 times a month. Very much would depend on local availability, because you can always buy something. If there is some roasted meat and you can buy it, legionaries did that. So yeah, it would vary tremendously. When it comes to wheat and barley, of course, wheat would be the norm for their puls, which is a type of soup that the Romans made. But if they were being punished, they would eat barley. Maybe he will mention that.
Given how susceptible meat was to infection and decay, plus the fact that this was several centuries before the invention of McDonald's French fries, every soldier received a generous salt ration.
Yeah.
This was considered essential because weak soldiers made a weak legion. In fact, salt was so important to survival that military salt works were established anytime a legion found themselves too far from seawater. To really drive home how valuable salt was to the Romans, we'd like to point out that the English word salary is derived from the Latin word salarium, which means pay, and was used to describe a soldier's pay, which they could use to buy more salt.
Yeah, yes and no. So yeah, the Latin word for salt is sal, then they have salarium, which is indeed the ration of salt that was given to the Romans. It's like it's part of their payment, but it's not as opposed to their payment. So it's not like the Romans were given a ration of salt, but that wasn't their entire stipend. They were still getting paid normally. So I think that is a little bit of a misconception right there if we go into the nitty-gritty details of the situation. But yeah, salt was valuable, so you receive your ration of salt. You could sell some of it and make some money, or you can keep it and use it for example, preservation that we have discussed, or to add flavor to food. So it is something valuable that they were given as a ration, but do consider it as a ration. It's not a substitute for pay.
The Roman author Pliny the Elder believed that the word salarium itself was derived from the word salarius, which means salt. He even claimed that Roman soldiers received their wages in the form of salt, which, while appreciated on the battlefield, was presumably difficult to invest.
Yeah, that one is a bit of a misinterpretation in my opinion.
In addition to roasted and boiled meat, many Roman soldiers also kept a supply of lucanica, which was a type of dried sausage that was good for eating on the go, like gas station beef jerky. According to a 5th century book on ancient cuisine called De Re Coquinaria, lucanica was a smoked sausage made with black pepper, cumin, savory, rue, parsley, bay laurel oil, liquamen, and well-minced lean meat.
Okay, so I would do away with the liquamen personally. I wouldn't use that, but the rest is fine. That sounds pretty good, actually.
The book doesn't mention what kind of meat was used, but other ancient sources suggest it might have been a pork sausage, and that the dish was often served with white porridge. Lucanica is actually still eaten in
the puls, absolutely. Still, do keep in mind that carbohydrates would have been the major staple of their food and their nutrition. So whether it be in the forms of a puls or whether it be the soup, the porridge, in fact, I translated it as soup earlier. It's more correctly a porridge. Whether it be the puls, which can be enriched with some lard, you could put some cheese in it, you could put some meat in it, or just eat it as is. Oftentimes they would use the wheat or barley to make bread, to make hardtack, which, of course, it being dehydrated, it doesn't spoil as easily, and then you can rehydrate it in some wine, for instance, or in some Posca. I'm not going to say what Posca is because I imagine he's going to say it, otherwise I will. It's a drink. You could take hardtack and put it inside the puls, and that rehydrates it, and then you can eat it without breaking your teeth, similar to the sort of hardtack that was given in ships, for example, even in as late as the 1800s. But yeah, there was a certain level of variety in the food that they would eat.
In Italy to this very day, although the recipe has changed a bit over the centuries.
Salsiccia luganega di suino arrotolata. Sì.
Look for it under the slightly different name of luganiga.
Here we go.
Grains were a primary source of sustenance for Rome's fearsome legions.
Correct.
Cereal grains gave Roman soldiers the quick energy bursts they needed for training and surviving on a battlefield.
And marching.
In fact, the typical Roman soldier ate somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/3 of a ton of grain on an annual basis.
Yes, so when we say grain, since earlier on I said wheat, important to just underline, to be specific, the variety changes depending on availability, but usually we're talking about ancient wheat.
That's a whole lot of frosted flakes. That being the case, one of the most basic staples of a Roman soldier's diet was bread. Unlike meat, fish, fruits, or vegetables, bread wouldn't spoil in the heat. It was also easy to make,
bread does spoil. It gets moldy.
Transport and store in large amounts, regardless of climate.
That is such a strange thing to say. I mean, maybe because he's American and you guys put so many preservatives in your stuff. I don't know, just joking. You know, I like America, that's where I live. But I do notice that, like in Italy, things spoil a lot faster. Whereas here, you guys keep your milk for forever in that fridge. Soft bread does spoil very fast and it becomes very hard, stale quickly. So there is that.
Greek historian Polybius reported that in his day, a Roman infantry soldier was rationed 26 kilograms of bread or hardtack, which was a type of biscuit or cracker made from flour, water, and salt, each month. Despite Polybius's testimony, modern historians believe it was far more common that legionnaires were provided with grain, which they would...
Can I be pedantic? Hey, you guys correct me all the time. Every time I mispronounce a word. Metatron actually, which I appreciate because I learn legionary, not legionnaire. There's a difference in English. These are legionaries.
Would then have to make into bread themselves. We know from several ancient sources that Roman legionnaires were expert bakers and cooks.
Absolutely, they did it themselves, yeah. Legionaries did do it themselves, but then sometimes they can be helped by the slaves. Because do remember that imagine you have a century. That's 18 fighting men, 20 slaves. That is because if you subdivide it, you go into the smallest unit, which is the contubernium, 8 fighting men, 2 slaves.
Each soldier had to carry his own rations, and when camp was made, each soldier would have to grind his own wheat into flour using a mill. That mill was typically shared with many other soldiers.
Yes, we're told that sometimes they would have 2 contubernia and they would share 1 mill, but sometimes you could have 1 mill per contubernium, kind of depends.
We assume a line formed. There's something appealing about the idea of warriors baking, like if Wonder Bread were a branch of the Special Forces. The bread baked by Roman soldiers, which was known as panis militaris, or military bread,
was panis militaris is right.
Very similar to bread as we know it today. The basic type was a mix of flour, water, and salt, but depending on the season, millet, barley, and oats may also be included. Some soldiers also included animal fat from their meat.
You remember the barley was usually considered a lower form of cereal, and the sources say good for animals and slaves. So it's usually when it's barley, it's because they're being punished.
Ration to increase the calorie count. Once the dough was mixed, it was left to rise in a humid environment. Next, it would be placed under a small bell-shaped bread oven known as a clebenus. You know, it kind of sounds like more historic battles could have been settled with a bake-off. Legionnaires didn't just get their grain to make bread. They also used it to create porridge, which is basically just wet bread, so hold your applause. Known as pulmentum or puls, the porridge was highly nutritious and easy to make in the field.
Yeah.
It could be made from grains like millet, barley, farro, or spelt.
It was probably pretty good, to be honest. I would love it.
The base ingredient would be toasted on hot stones, then ground up and mixed with boiling water, salt, and sometimes meat, if any slow-moving animals happen to be nearby. The resulting mush could be eaten as porridge, or allowed to set into firm cakes, which was a handy way of preserving leftovers. Porridge making was such a common practice that in the early Republic era, Roman soldiers were given the nickname Puritiphagonives, or porridge eaters, by their Greek neighbors.
Yeah, they did have cheese. They also had legumes. I wonder if he's going to talk about that, because Julius Caesar mentions the legumes that they were eaten by the legionaries in the De Bello Gallico.
Cheese occupied a central place in the diet of Roman military men. A legionnaire's daily rations typically included 1 ounce of hard cheese, or as the Romans called it, dry cheese, known as pecorino. Pecorino translates from Italian as sheep, so you can probably guess where it...
Not a sheep. Sheep is pecora. Pecorino is just sheep cheese, basically. But yeah, it's just the name of the cheese which contains the word for sheep. But pecorino is not how we say sheep. Sheep is pecora.
Came from. That's right, the dairy section of the Sheeply Wiggly.
Thank you.
Just kidding. Sheep and goats were a common source of cheese in Mediterranean regions. Soldiers stationed in the northern parts of Europe, however, tended to use the milk of cows they impounded from the locals. And in the later parts of the Roman era, cow's milk would become more popular in general. Cheese was popular because its fat...
I loved goat cheese, by the way. Even today, we get a frozen pizza here, which has goat cheese in it, and it's really good.
Contributed to disease resistance and longevity. Also, many of the soldiers owned their own livestock, which made it cheap and convenient to make cheese from the milk of their own animals. Romans were actually so big on cheese, they often educated new subjects they conquered in the fine art of cheese making. Can you imagine? First, your village is razed during a siege. Now your captors are making you take cheese-making courses, typically booked by newlyweds on their honeymoon. War truly is hell.
Vegetables, yeah.
Unlike your average 5-year-old, Roman soldiers love to eat vegetables. Unfortunately, vegetables tend to spoil quickly and don't travel easily. So if the legions wanted vegetables, they usually had to, steal.
Well, steal, yes, sure. But then again, also buy it in the local markets if they were in allied territory, right? If you're in enemy territory, then yes, you grab anything you find.
Farmers just had to live with the possibility that on any given day, an army might show up on their land and take some or even all of their crops. It is a matter of historical record that you just couldn't say no to the Roman legion. As for what kinds of vegetables the Roman army consumed, that's a bit of a mystery. Historians tend to think the soldiers probably weren't too picky. When it came to vegetables, if it was edible, the legionnaires were probably willing to eat it.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment.
That being said, whatever they were eating didn't seem to help them ward off scurvy, as reports of the disease were fairly common. Sounds like they should have plundered a few citrus groves.
Posca, very nice.
So with all this meat and cheese and grain to eat, the soldiers obviously needed something to wash it all down.
Right.
And that something was usually Posca.
See.
Essentially just spoiled wine or vinegar mixed with water. Posca.
Yeah, I mean, that's what vinegar is. If you call it spoiled wine, it makes it sound horrible, but yeah, it's vinegar with water. He pronounced it well, though. Posca.
Was sometimes mixed with herbs, salt, lemon juice, or fruit to make...
That's actually a specific recipe that is late Roman, maybe even post-Roman, Byzantine probably. We don't know that for the ancient Romans themselves. It's possible, but it's far more likely that it was just red wine, vinegar, and water. And we don't know the ratio.
Make it a little tastier. Emphasis on a little. Posca was typically associated with slaves, paupers, and lower-ranking soldiers. In fact, it was so strongly associated with the common man that generals and other high-ranking officers would often drink Posca with the rank-and-file troops as a show of solidarity.
Can you imagine that? Like, it's actually something I appreciate of classical antiquity and their generals and even emperors sometimes. It's the fact that they would sit down, eat what their legionaries were eating, drink with them, laugh with them, and then go to war with them. Imagine, compare that with modern politicians and convince them to do that. Go to a war, sit down, eat with rations, military rations with the soldiers, and then go to the battlefront. I appreciate that, actually, classical antiquity, specifically the generals and the legati, and it actually makes sense as to why they would be so popular, that at the end of the day, the legionaries were a lot more loyal to their general than they were to the senators, or even the emperor sometimes, depending, but usually it's a problem with the senators. Emperor is kind of a different situation. But since we're talking about Posca, there is one thing I want to share, and I know that some people disagree with me on this one, but I still want to share it as food for thought. So take it or leave it. I do believe that since Posca, wine and vinegar, is the regular drink of a legionary, I always use this as my own way to reinterpret the way we usually consider or read those passages in the gospel that mention when Jesus is being crucified and then he's thirsty. And what does the Roman legionary do? He takes a sponge, puts it inside, dips it inside a vase or an amphora full of vinegar that was just nearby, and then gives the vinegar to Jesus's, touches like Jesus's lips to give him something to drink. And that, I was always told back in the day when I was a child that, oh, look at this legionary mocking. Jesus is thirsty and he gives him vinegar. I think that's the wrong modernist way to look at it. I think, in fact, what the legionary was doing there should be interpreted as an act of compassion. And at the end of the day, from the perspective of a Roman, he just gave him his drink. So the way I look at it is people saying, oh, look, he's thirsty, give him water. And then the legionary is like, nah, don't just give him water. The man is dying. Give him something better. Give him some Posca and give him his drink. I think it's an act of compassion, not an act of mockery at all. It looks like an act of mockery because we are used to drink this, non-sponsored, which is rubbish, by the way. It's basically probably better to drink a little Posca here and there.
Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a factory owner scoring points with the workforce by sharing a six-pack of Milwaukee's Best with them.
Pretty much.
Posca had the reputation of being an acquired taste that was surprisingly refreshing. As a bonus, it had the ability to disinfect non-potable water.
Right.
Actually, that kind of makes it sound like you shouldn't be drinking it, right?
Well, no, because you've got to drink. You've got to drink, mate. It's actually not bad, Posca's. Pretty good.
Of course, when it came to drinking, Roman soldiers often wanted something a little stronger than Posca, namely wine. Wine was supposed to be drunk on alternate days with Posca, but the soldiers had a habit of overindulging.
Yeah, that really depends. Let's not build a myth here. There were, in fact, periods in which they were completely prohibited from drinking it, and there were times in which, yeah, you could drink, but you couldn't be drunk and wasted if you're a legionary. Maybe they would let them drink a bit more after a battle during the loot and splitting or something like that, but legionaries had to be sharp.
In fact, legionnaires liked their wine so much that on several occasions, generals had to issue decrees to prevent them from getting too hammered.
Yeah.
The Roman soldiers were so into wine that they planted vineyards wherever they went. Beer, which was popular with the Celts and Germanic tribes, was considered a barbarian drink that wasn't fit for a Roman legionnaire.
I can't stand that he says legionnaire. Sorry, I know, it's just me. Yeah, anyways, there's probably quite a few people that can't stand a few things I say or the way I say them. Regardless, initially, yeah, he's correct. Eventually, they do start drinking beer, though.
The feeling, however, was not mutual. The Celts and the Germanic tribes apparently held Roman wine in such high regard, they sometimes traded one slave per jar for it. And that wasn't even the really good stuff.
Man, could you imagine that? The Germans, Germanic people, they like their alcohol, no matter what it is, I guess. Anyways, very cool. That's pretty much the end of this section about the food eaten by the legionaries. So yes, it's a very interesting topic, and I enjoyed this. Just a couple of things that, yeah, but at the end of the day, it was well made. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Goodbye, number ones.